Our speaker tonight is a very experienced speaker in Toastmasters. It's Mann. Alan has worked, tell you a little bit about his background. He's worked for various manufacturing companies for over 35 years, and he's been a supply chain professional. His specific responsibilities are purchasing and material planning, which is really right at the heart of the company's supply chain operation. Alan's an active member of the San Fernando Valley chapter of the Institute for Supply Management. With the term supply chain in the news today so much, Alan's going to make sense for us about what's going on as how it relates to you. His pathway is strategic relationships. This is a level 5 elective, preparing to speak professionally, 18 to 22 minutes. The title is A Nest Full of Chains. A Nest Full of Chains, Mann.
You're muted, Alan. Alan, you're muted.
Please unmute and restart.
Alan, stop sharing the screen and then unmute yourself if you're having a problem.
Can you hear me now?
There.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. It's all the fault of the government. It's the owners of the freight lines. It's, no, it's consumers' fault. The other day I was listening to talk radio, and 5 different people came up with 6 different people to blame for this supply chain problem. The only thing they could agree upon is with this nest of chains, there are a few broken links. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and most welcome guest. Yes, there is a supply chain issue in the news, but are they telling us really what is really the reason? Tonight, I'm going to give you a supply chain 101 course, give you some understanding what a supply chain really is, because all they talk about in the news, they throw out this term supply chain. And a lot of people don't even know what this means. Just a second here.
Alan, put the cursor on the screen and then hit the forward arrow key. There you go.
That is a sort of textbook definition of what a supply chain is. A supply chain involves a series of steps involved in getting the product or service to the end customer, you or me. The step includes moving, transforming raw material into finished products, transportation, transporting those products, distributing them to the end user. This involves the whole chain of steps to take the raw material and get you this smartphone. Now look at if you have your smartphone handy with you, just for a minute, imagine all the different raw material components that is made of. Just look at that for a second. Then think of all the different processes to form those raw materials into subcomponents. You have to get those to the next level, to assembly. And then once this thing is finally assembled, out to you, the consumer. Everything has a supply chain. As I said, this phone, which has a relatively complex supply chain. This machine valve body, which is something I purchased at work. And even my wife's Southwestern style egg beaters. Everything has a supply chain. These are the key links. The mining, processing of the raw materials into the subcomponents. For example, this machine body, you have to mine the raw material, and then the raw material is sent to a mill where it is formed to big, long bars of bar stock. The logistics, again, from getting it from the raw state where the mill to the mill, then from the mill into the distribution cycle. Now, this particular material comes from Sweden. So the raw material is milled in Sweden, and the logistics to get it from Sweden to over here in the United States to a distributor who sells a bar stock to one of my machine shops. Warehousing at various steps. And just again, the distribution of sales. Now, this, most of you won't buy this kind of item, but the distribution, there is a distribution cycle just for the Southwestern style egg beater. And somewhere in the chain, somebody is looking at a program deciding, well, you know what, my Walmart store over here in Simi Valley looks like it's out. I have to tell the warehouse to send more to the Simi Valley Walmart store. And hopefully they do that. They don't always do that, but that's what they're supposed to do. And then there's factors that can affect a supply chain. Supply and demand. How many people remember the first couple of days after the lockdown? All of a sudden, there was a big demand put in the system for toilet paper or any paper products, and the supply disappeared. It was like the supply chain for toilet paper was kicked in the stomach. So there was a supply or demand, and the demand outweighed the supply. And for a couple of weeks, or more than a couple of weeks, the stores were allocating how much toilet paper you can go and buy at the store. The availability of logistics, and this is one of the problems that we're seeing right now, is all those ships, not just out here on the West Coast, but what's not in the news is the same problem is happening on the East Coast of the United States, in Dave's neck of the world. I mean, it's not getting any news, but the same issue about availability of logistics. The ships need to get into port. They need to, even if they were unloaded, let's say they could unload a ship in a day. The next step would be the trucks and the trains to take that on to the next step. And it's really amazing what some of the logistics that are involved. When I was growing up, the Port of Portland was where cars were offloaded from Japan. And you could see the ships come in that carried the cars. They were offloaded, and there were special trucks there to take the cars to the railheads to go out to places out in the Midwest and even the East Coast of the United States. act of God. Yes, forces of nature, and that's what we call act of God, force majeure, can affect a supply chain. 2016, there was a series of major earthquakes in Japan, and it devastated the semiconductor industry. For about 3 years, it took 3 years for the semiconductor industry in Japan to come back. Another example, act of God, was back around the same time. Off the coast of Iceland, there was a series of major volcanoes. And what does these volcanoes did? One, they were forming new islands, but they're also spewing ash into the air right in the middle of the routes major airlines and FedEx took to take goods from Europe to the United States. And in my case, I was ordering parts from India that would go into England, and they were just sitting in the ground in England because of all this ash that was spewing in the air, and it covered a massive area. It wasn't a small area that was affected, and planes were grounded. So act of God. And of course, COVID is we will classify a pandemic as a act of God, but that can affect what's going on. Labor force. Let's say a certain segment of the labor force decides to go out on strike. Let's say FedEx. I don't know. Let's say FedEx, if they were unionized and they decided to strike, or if UPS were to decide to strike, imagine the effect that would have on the flow of goods. This was so serious that in 1950, the railroads went on strike. And President Truman, to remedy the situation, nationalized the railroads and basically turned every person who worked for the railroad into a federal worker to fix the problem. Other factors, public policy and law. During the Trump administration, there were tariffs that were thrown up against aluminum that came into the United States. And this created shortages in the auto industry that uses a lot of aluminum. There were half-finished F-150s at Ford that couldn't be completed because they couldn't get aluminum. We also have other public policies that are coming out of the current president that are also affecting the supply chain. Unions, I've touched about unions. There's a lot of people that are, unions have a major effect even now. Even other groups, different white, depending on certain aspects of the law. For example, let's say in corporate law, those lawyers who decide, well, maybe we'll advise the corporations to send their work overseas, be maybe more profitable. There's a lot of small outside segments within that affect supply chain. Accounting, accountants, if they don't pay the company's bills, then you go on credit hold. If, for example, my company were to go on credit hold with a major supplier, that would affect the flow of materials into my company. And that has happened. There have been corporate policies that, oh, let's just hold off on paying the bills to the beginning of the next quarter. Well, that looks good on the accounting statements, but a lot of suppliers don't like to be not paid. So they'll just put us on hold, and that shuts down lines. Foreign policy. How many people, well, Dave, it's a little before your time, but the oil crisis of the late 70s, foreign policy the Arabs going to war with each other, if there's a war in other parts of the world, this can affect the supply chain. There is actually policy that's required by corporations that you cannot buy raw material where the source is from certain African countries. It's called conflict minerals. So that again is a foreign policy. It's also public policy, but also affects our relations with certain countries. If we're embargoing certain companies, it's going to affect the supply chain. And us, the consumer, that affects the supply chain because we set the demand. If all of a sudden everybody wanted this iPhone, which is an i13, or Linda told me to go out and buy everything, all the Southwestern style egg beaters that Walmart had, that's going to have an effect on the supply. I'm going to talk briefly about this gentleman. People may have heard of someone by the name of Henry Ford, founder of Ford Motor Company. What he's known for is applying mass production techniques, the assembly line, to making cars, making it affordable. But one of the other things he did that also affected the affordability of the car and his ability to control costs was having control over the supply chain. Now, what do I mean by having control over the supply chain? He owned the mines where raw material was used to make the metal parts. He had ships that took the raw material over the Great Lakes to mills to have it formed into the parts that made up his cars. He owned the mills, and he had control over certain railroads. For those areas he did not have control, he had alliances. He was good friends with a gentleman by the name of Henry Firestone, who was the founder of Firestone Tires. So he had control or influence on everything that was coming in to make his cars. There's another gentleman more recent that's doing essentially the same thing. Jeff Bezos, the founder and owner of Amazon. Amazon used to be a bookstore, but now Amazon has alliances with thousands and thousands of suppliers. Amazon also is now going to owning planes, trucks. Rather than using FedEx, Federal Express, U.S. Postal Service, and United Parcel Service, UPS, he is taking control over the delivery of the products from his suppliers, and also taking control over getting the item that we buy. So you see all these Amazon trucks all around your neighborhood. There's distribution centers for Amazon popping up everywhere. So this gentleman, going back to Henry Ford, he was the one who originally came up with the idea, you know what, maybe if I control my supply chain, I can control costs and beat out my competitors. So what does this all mean to you? Many people don't really have a sense or even of what is involved that goes on behind the scenes. And just an example, a couple years ago, myself and Linda went on a cruise. And although it was great to get on the cruise, I had this sort of deep appreciation for the logistics and how the supply chain that Princess Cruise and other cruise liners have to support their ships. Now think about it. A ship can come into the port of Long Beach at about 8 o'clock in the morning. It can unload its passengers, clean up the ship, reload, restock its supplies, and board new passengers and be at sea by 4:15 in the afternoon. Think about all the logistics and the supply chain that's involved to make something like that happen. And if there's shortages of food, for example, they run out of broccoli. Yeah, when they likes broccoli, on their next stop, they could restock with broccoli. I knew somebody who worked as a buyer for Princess Cruise, and he was telling me that you go under the corporate headquarters and they literally show at any given point where all the ships are, and they need to know this because in case they need to resupply the ship. What we see is a simplistic view of the issues at hand. We see in the news ships that can't dock, and an armada of ships that cannot dock. But it's just not the fact that ships cannot dock and unload. Okay, what happens if they can unload? What's the next step? How are they going to get these shipping containers on to the next step? In the case of this piece of material, the problem is not ships, it's the fact that the mill has been closed down for 5 months during the depth of the pandemic, and all of a sudden there's a shortage of material, and my suppliers cannot even get the raw material. And even if they get the raw material, they don't have people to machine the parts because there's also a shortage of labor in the world right now, at least here in the United States. And finally, the problems we are seeing are not world ending. Yes, the delivery of this iPhone, last I heard, was out to late December. And there's obviously a problem in the ports, and there's shortages at the mill. And sometimes Walmart runs out of Linda's eggs. Not that it is not because the chickens aren't laying eggs, but they just run out. But supply chains, there's always a way to fix it and hook it up to another chain. There's always a workaround, and there's always been supply chain problems. And most of the time, it doesn't get to the point where it gets into the news. But obviously, we are living in interesting times where all of a sudden there's this armada of ships, and people think, well, there's the problem. But it's bigger than that. There's different kinds of problems relating to supply chain. And like a kidney stone, these supply chains issues will pass and other issues will come up, and some fix will come up to fix this nest of chains. Mr. Toastmaster.